It seems like every time you turn around, there's another headline about the judiciary.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And especially lately, all the buzz has been about how judges are appointed. You know, you have this recent discovery of cash at Justice Varma's house.
Right.
Really puts the spotlight right back on that selection process.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, you have the vice president weighing in saying, you know, maybe things would be different if the NJAC was still around.
Interesting.
It all boils down to a pretty fundamental question, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, who gets to decide who sits on the bench? Who holds that power?
And for you thinking about UPSC, this is exactly the kind of thing that could pop up on either the mains or prelims.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it's not just about the news of the day. It's tied into constitutional history, the balance of power between branches.
Yeah, and it's a debate that's still going on, right?
Oh, definitely very much alive.
So for all our UPSC aspirants out there, we're going to do a deep dive today on exactly this. We're going to be using a really insightful report from The Hindu as our guide.
Sounds good.
And we're aiming to go beyond just the headlines.
Yeah, I got to get deeper.
Give you that clear understanding. You need to really tackle this topic, whether it's mains or prelims.
All right, let's jump in.
So where do we even begin with this whole process of judicial appointments in India?
Well, like always, you got to start with the foundation, the Constitution itself.
Okay, right back to the source.
Exactly. So we're talking Article 124. That's where the Supreme Court is established.
Got it.
And within that Article 124, too, that's the key provision for appointments.
So what does it actually say?
Basically, it lays out that the president appoints Supreme Court judges, but it's based on the advice of the Council of Ministers.
Okay, so the executive branch is involved right from the start.
Right. And then there's another layer. It says that this is done after consulting with the Chief Justice of India.
So there's the judicial input, too.
Exactly. It might sound straightforward at first glance, but you know how it is.
Yeah, things are rarely that simple.
There are always layers of interpretation, historical context that comes into play.
And even way back when they were drafting the Constitution, they were already having different opinions on this very issue, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And if you're thinking about the intent of the framers, it's crucial to consider these viewpoints.
Right, like whose vision really won out.
So Ambedkar, for example, he had some serious reservations about giving the Chief Justice veto power in this process.
He didn't want the CJI to be able to just shut things down.
Exactly. He was very much against replacing the word consultation with concurrence in that article.
Interesting. So he saw a more active role for the executive.
It seems that way. And keep in mind that this preference for executive involvement kind of played out in the early decades after independence.
Yeah, you're talking like 1950s to the 70s.
Right, that period.
Yeah.
The Hindu points out that even though there were some constitutional amendments happening, there wasn't this huge, widespread worry about judicial independence being threatened.
Like everyone was pretty comfortable with how things were working.
It seems so, at least initially, but then things started to shift in the 70s.
What happened?
Well, there are a few instances that started raising eyebrows about whether the executive was overstepping its bounds.
Like trying to exert too much control over the judiciary?
Right, and there's one example that really stands out as a turning point.
Okay, I'm listening.
The appointment of Justice M.H. Beg as Chief Justice in 1977.
What was so controversial about that?
Well, he was appointed over Justice H.R. Khanna, who was actually the senior-most judge at the time.
Oh, wow, so they kind of jumped over the next in line.
Exactly, and it was seen as a pretty clear signal that the executive was flexing its muscles, asserting its preferences.
Yeah, I can see how that would set off alarm bells about judicial autonomy.
Absolutely. People started to worry, could the judiciary truly act independently if the executive had this much sway over appointments?
And then right on the heels of that, you have the first judge's case in 1981, the S.P. Gupta case.
That's a big one for your UPSC notes.
So what happened there?
Well, the Supreme Court actually sided with the initial understanding of Article 124.
Meaning?
They said that consultation didn't actually equal concurrence.
So the executive still had the final say.
Exactly. The judiciary's opinion mattered, but it wasn't binding on the government.
So for about a decade, that was the prevailing interpretation.
Right. But then in the 90s, the whole landscape shifted dramatically.
This is where the second and third judges' cases come in.
Exactly. And this is really where the judiciary starts to assert itself.
Like a power shift.
You could say that the second judge's case in 1993 is a landmark ruling.
Huge for anyone studying the Indian judicial system.
Absolutely. The Supreme Court basically reversed its earlier stance.
Whoa. So they were like, Actually, we were wrong.
In essence, yeah, they declared the consultation did in fact mean concurrence.
So the judiciary's voice now had real weight.
Right, and this is what paved the way for the Collegium system that we have today.
The third judge's case a few years later just kind of solidified the details of how it works.
Precisely. Now, this is a key point for your UPSC prep.
Okay, tell me more.
The Collegium system, it's not actually mentioned anywhere in the Constitution.
Really, it's kind of a judicial creation.
Exactly. It emerged entirely from these Supreme Court judgments.
So how does this collegium system actually work in practice?
Well, it depends on what level we're talking about.
Okay, break it down for me.
So for Supreme Court appointments, you have a collegium headed by the Chief Justice of India and the 4 next most senior judges of the Supreme Court.
Okay, so a pretty small group.
Right. They're responsible for recommending names for SC judges, as well as for Chief Justices of the High Courts, and even for transferring High Court judges.
A lot of power there.
And then for appointments to the High Courts themselves, there's a smaller collegium.
Okay, who's in that one?
That one consists of the CJI and the 2 senior-most Supreme Court judges.
Got it. So it's essentially the judiciary selecting its own members.
In a nutshell, yes, but as you can imagine, that hasn't been without its critics.
Yeah, the article from the Hindu we're looking at definitely lays out some concerns.
Rightly so. It's important to understand those criticisms.
So what are some of the main ones leveled against the collegium system?
Well, a big one is transparency, or the lack thereof.
Like it's all happening behind closed doors.
Exactly. The deliberations aren't public, so people don't really know how these decisions are being made.
And that can breed distrust, right?
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of accountability.
Meaning?
There's no real formal mechanism to hold the collegium accountable for its choices.
So someone's recommended and people question it. It's not clear how to challenge that or get answers.
Right. And that's led to accusations of lobbying and favoritism within the system.
Like it's all about who you know.
That's the perception among some, and all of this dissatisfaction kind of sets the stage for what happens next.
Which is the attempt to establish the NJAC.
Exactly, the National Judicial Appointments Commission.
So this was Parliament saying, okay, we need to reform this process. The collegium isn't working.
Right, they wanted a new system altogether to replace it.
And when does this all take place?
So we're talking 2014 Parliament passed both the Constitution 99th Amendment Act and the NJJC Act.
Laying the groundwork for this new commission.
Yep, one that would oversee appointments to both the Supreme Court and the High Courts.
And they didn't want it to be just a bunch of judges making the decisions, right?
No, they wanted a broader perspective. So the NJJC was designed as a 6-member body.
Okay, who are the players?
You had the Chief Justice of India as the chairperson, of course.
Makes sense.
Then the 2 senior-most Supreme Court judges were also included.
Still representing the judiciary.
Right. And then you had the Union Minister of Law and Justice representing the executive branch.
Okay, so that's 3. Then who are the other 3?
The other 3 were really interesting. They were 2 eminent persons.
Eminent persons meaning what exactly?
Basically, people from civil society with recognized expertise and stature.
Not necessarily judges or politicians?
No, the idea was to bring in outside perspectives, and these eminent persons were to be nominated by a special committee.
Another layer of complexity.
Right. This committee would consist of the CJI, the Prime Minister, and the leader of the opposition in the Lok Sabha.
Wow, so a lot of high-level figures involved in shaping this NJJC.
Definitely. And it's worth noting that it had quite a bit of support.
Yeah, the Hindu article mentions that it passed Parliament almost unanimously.
And even got ratified by 16 state legislatures.
That's pretty significant. A lot of people were on board with changing the system.
It seemed like a real push for reform, but then, of course, the Supreme Court stepped in.
Yeah, in 2015, they declared the whole thing unconstitutional.
A 4.1 majority judgment, so not a unanimous decision, but a pretty decisive one.
A real turning point.
Huh.
So what was their main reasoning for striking down the NJJC?
The core issue was the potential for influence from the non-judicial members.
Those eminent persons and the law minister.
Exactly the way the law was written, any 2 members could veto a recommendation.
So theoretically, you could have the executive branch teaming up with one eminent person and blocking a judicial appointment.
That's the concern the court had. They felt it undermined judicial independence.
Like the executive could potentially stack the courts with judges favorable to them.
Right, and that's where the Basic Structure Doctrine comes in.
Ah, another important concept for UPSC.
Absolutely. It basically says there are certain core features of the Constitution that can't be changed even by amendment.
Like foundational principles.
Exactly, and the court felt that judicial independence was one of those core principles.
So they argued that the NJJC was trying to mess with something that's untouchable.
That was their reasoning, and they felt that giving the judiciary primacy in appointments was the only way to truly safeguard its independence.
So we were essentially saying the judiciary needs to be able to choose its own to protect itself from outside pressure.
That's how they saw it, but it
Yeah.
wasn't a unanimous decision, remember?
Right. Justice Shillensworth had a dissenting opinion.
And it's important to understand his perspective as well.
Okay, so what did he have to say?
Well, he was very critical of the existing Collegium system. He pointed out all its flaws, the lack of transparency, the potential for favoritism, and he felt that a well-structured NJAC could actually address those problems.
So he thought it could be more accountable, more transparent.
Exactly. He saw it as a potential improvement, and even within the majority, there were some reservations.
Yeah, Justice Joseph, right?
Yes, he agreed with striking down the NJAC, but he acknowledged the problems with the Collegium.
Like he wasn't totally happy with going back to the old system.
And reportedly, he later said he regretted striking down the NJAC precisely because those problems persisted.
So even within the judiciary, there was this recognition that the Collegium wasn't perfect.
Definitely. And this kind of highlights the ongoing debate and the search for a better system.
So where do things stand now? The NJAC's gone. Is there any chance of reform in the future?
Well, the door isn't completely closed. The article mentions some alternative proposals that have been floated.
Like what kind of ideas?
Well, some people have suggested giving the CJI a casting vote in any appointment body.
So even if the other members were split, the CJI could break the tie, ensuring judicial control.
Exactly. Or another idea is to remove the veto power of non-judicial members.
So the executive wouldn't be able to block appointments.
Right. Or maybe having stricter guidelines so the executive can't just keep sending back recommendations they don't like.
Interesting. So there are options on the table.
Definitely. The question is, will there be the political will to revisit this issue?
The NJAC was a pretty big push and it got shut down.
Yeah, it's seen as a bit of a missed opportunity.
Especially since the criticisms of the Collegium haven't gone away.
Right. The lack of transparency, the potential for internal politics, those concerns are still there.
So ultimately, what's the big challenge here?
I think it's finding that balance between judicial independence and accountability.
Two essential principles that sometimes seem to clash.
Exactly. How do we ensure that the judiciary is free from outside pressure, but also answerable to the public in some way?
Yeah, and all within the framework of our Constitution.
That's the puzzle, and it's one that's still being worked out.
So just to recap, for all our UPSC aspirants out there, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have quite a journey.
We've started with Article 124, the constitutional basis for all of this.
The foundation.
Then we looked at how the power dynamic shifted over time from executive dominance to the Collegium system.
Through those landmark Supreme Court cases.
We talked about the NJAC, the attempt to reform the process, and how it was ultimately struck down.
And the ongoing debate over transparency and accountability.
It's a lot to digest, but it's all crucial for understanding this issue.
Definitely. And for your UPSC prep, it's important to see this not just as a static legal issue, but as this dynamic interplay between different branches of government.
It's about power, who holds it, who wants it.
Exactly. And how do they try to achieve their goals within the system?
So to wrap things up, we want to leave you with a question.
A little something to ponder.
Given everything we've discussed, where do you think this whole process of judicial appointments is headed next?
What might the next chapter look like?
What are the key elements that need to be in place to really get that balance right?
Between independence and accountability.
A tough question, but a really important one.
And one that might just come up in your UPSC exams.
So make sure you like and subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments.
We want to hear your insights.
And don't forget, this deep dive is based on a really informative article from The Hindu.
Definitely check it out.
It's a great resource for staying on top of current affairs.
Especially those relevant to UPSC.
All right, until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Happy studying, everyone!